Costin Raiu.
I think it's important to remember all the healthcare professionals who, while we are here talking about security computers, healthcare professionals are out there saving lives of our family members, of our friends. So let's keep them in mind in our prayers. And if you guys, if you can donate, even like the smallest amount helps. It helps all these extraordinary people out there to fight um, with the enemy, with the invisible enemy, right? Some words today. Sergey challenged me to do a presentation combining a couple of things. Yara and chess. I tell you a secret or a story. Maybe not many people know that, but when I was little, uh, I went to my parents and I begged them. I said, please send me to the Pioneers Palace. And back in the old communist times, that was the place you wanted to be if you wanted to learn things like chess. So I said, please, parents, send me to the Pioneers Palace. Well, instead, they sent me to learn tennis. And as a result of that, now I'm a very poor tennis player, and probably I'm an even worse chess player. But nevertheless, I enjoyed doing this a lot. And today I will talk a bit about that as well. So combining code similarity with Yara to find goodies, and who is Citizen Kane and why he always loses at chess. Well, um, I guess that everybody pretty much like myself here, you're locked at home, and if people want to wear the mask, that is okay. Keep 2 meters apart, very important, all these things. Like you, I guess I've been stuck at home for maybe I don't even remember how many weeks. Was it 5, 6 weeks? So I had to find some ways to, let's say, develop some new hobbies like growing garlic in the balcony. I adopted 2 pet spiders. I call them Man the Spider and Eve the Spider. I did some pizza research, baking all sorts of pizzas, spending probably too much time in Teams or Zoom or Jitsi. And by the way, if you're interested in webinars, I can also recommend 2 webinars I've done, Hunting APTs with Yara on BrightTech and Tap Your Home Internet for APTs during OPCD that you can find on YouTube. But nevertheless, today we want to talk a bit about Yara. So as an introduction to Yara, the so-called Swiss knife of pattern matching is I would call it, it's a bit more than just pattern matching. It's more like a programming language created by Victor Manuel Alvarez, who currently works for Google when he was in VirusTotal, HISPASEC in the old days. And I'm hoping that he's watching this presentation as well, together with his colleagues, Julio Canto, Bernardo. Hi, guys. And thanks again for creating this amazing tool. The latest version of Yara is actually 4.0, and it was released today. And I know they did that on purpose so that I have to change my presentation slides, which unfortunately I didn't have time to do anymore. So although it says it's 3.11 from October, actually version 4.0 was released today. So it's super, super hot. In case you never saw a Yara rule, this is what it looks like. And special gracias to my good friend and chess partner, Vicente. So what we see here, it says pretty much everything rule. Welcome to our webinar, or welcome to SAS at Home. And there's 3 major sections in there. There's a meta section, there's a string section, and we have a condition section. And leaving the meta section aside for a moment, looking just at strings and condition, we see we have 3 strings defined in there. A, which is kind, B, which is funny, and C, which is imaginary. Then we have a condition, which is $A and $B, and not $C. So how do you find real friends? Well, they have to be kind and funny, and hopefully not imaginary. Those are definitely the good, real friends. Meta section, I think that it's greatly overlooked by many. You can pretty much put anything in the meta section, and I think that a lot of people don't pay attention to this meta section, but I think it's one of the, even like it's not really used in the rule itself, it's still very important. But of course, by now, let's say people who don't have a lot of experience with Yara might be wondering what you can do with this thingy. And here's a few usages for it. One can identify and classify malware, which I guess is the main usage of Yara. That's what we use it most of the time, I say. Finding new malware samples, new exploits, new 0 days. It can be very helpful speeding up incident response. But as well as increasing your defenses by just deploying custom Yara rules inside your organization. Some people do use Yara, for instance, to filter network traffic. Why not? There's a tool called Yara PCAP that you can use for this purpose. And actually, there's people out there, not me, I'm not that good. My colleague Vitaly can actually make presentations in Yara, and I recommend watching his presentation in Yara after this SaaS at home finishes. So who uses Yara? I think that pretty much every serious security company, several appliance vendors, for instance, FireEye, VirusTotal, obviously, ClamAV, Fortune 500 companies, even spyware developers. And during the hacking team breach, we discovered that actually hacking team had a number of Yara rules defined on VirusTotal that would alert them whenever someone was uploading a sample of their malware to VirusTotal. So it's, I would say, quite popular out there. Now, just a few words about Yara rules, and I think it's very important to keep in mind that not all Yara rules are made the same. And there can be, of course, pretty Yara rules which are not very good. There can be good Yara rules which are not very pretty, and there can be, of course, ugly Yara rules which are terrible. And obviously, those are the ones that we want to avoid. So let me shoot actually a question at the audience. If there's people with experience in reading or writing Yara rules, what do you guys make of this Yara rule on the screen? Is it a good rule? Is it maybe not such a good rule? What's your opinion? I'll try to watch the chat and see some opinions and feedback from your side. Meanwhile, by just looking, let's say, carefully at the Yara rule, we can try to think like, is it a good one? So one thing that I would immediately notice here is that, well, there's no rule in there. It just says Yara rules, and there's the curly bracket, but there's basically no name. And we have no meta, there's meta missing. It's good for matching only against that specific RSA key, not enough meta, might trigger, but on what? Excellent, you guys are absolute experts in Yara rules. So I'm sure that everybody's here just for the chess, right? So yeah, this is possibly not the best Yara rule out there. First of all, it will not work because it misses the rule and the rule name. There's a meta with a beautiful description saying RSA key, but it doesn't tell us the RSA key of what. What does it detect? We don't know. And the condition there is just any of them. But obviously, if the bad guys change the key, then this rule will not find anything anymore. Here's another example of a Yara rule. I would say that it's pretty much in the same line of thinking. Again, does not have a rule name. The description talks about DDoS, misspelled strings. What do you guys think? Is this a good rule or a bad rule, or is it worse than the previous one? Well, some people saying fail. It's a bad rule. It's not so good. Well, I would say that, again, probably not the best rule out there. And by now, I guess that everybody is wondering, all right, Costin, you're showing us all these Yara rules, but what does a good rule look like? And let me show you a rule written by Florian Roth, who, in my humble opinion, is probably one of the best Yara rule writers or authors out there. So by just looking at the rule, you immediately notice a couple of things. So one of the things that I noticed immediately is that even the rule name, it tells you what this will detect. So it's called what? APT17 underscore malware. So immediately know that this detects APT17 malware. Well, secondly, we have their author. We have a reference that we can check. Actually, we can click on that and we'll get to a page which talks about the malware that this rule detects. We have a date. We have a hash. So we can actually use this hash to fetch a sample that is actually the sample that Florian used to write this Yara rule. And then we have the strings, a couple of strings, and the condition which checks if this is actually an MZ file. It checks the file size and the strings. Another example here of a rule comes from Juan's amazing research on Nazar, the lost amulet. If you're unfamiliar with this, I recommend you guys to watch his talk. It's very interesting. Also, the paper, Juan was able to identify one of the previously unknown signatures from the famous 6.py leaked by the shadow brokers. And I will not ask the audience if this is a good or not Yara rule, because I'm sure everybody will say it's a very bad rule. I can see Pedro saying it's a very bad rule. Actually, well, it's okay. I would say it's okay. If we were to nitpick on Juan, and this is definitely not something that we want to do, but let's say if somebody else was to nitpick, they would complain that Juan didn't put a date in the rule and the version. But again, this is like really extreme nitpicking that we obviously don't want to do. And of course, we spoke a bit about the prettiness of these rules. Are they pretty or not? Do they allow us to, let's say anything about the malware that the rule detects or not? But we haven't spoken yet about the rule detection quality. And in terms of quality, actually, there's a lot of tricky things. So one of the most common mistakes that we see is that the rule generates too many false positives. So that's why it's very important to test the rule first. And actually, I've seen rules published by important organizations, let's say, that when you actually run them on a production system, they false on a Chrome or Adobe Reader, on Microsoft Internet Explorer. So it's absolutely terrible. When you do that in production, you have a few hundred or thousand machines, and you detect this new thing on all of them. It's almost the equivalent of a disaster. I've seen cases, I think it was a case of Grizzly Step, when there was a rule there for a, was it a web shell, a PHP web shell or SP web shell, that again was falsing. So people, freaking out that they've been hacked by the APT. So very important, in my opinion, test the rules first, make sure that they don't have any false positives. Here's another example of a rule. The rule that is based on imports. So I've seen actually this quite a couple of times when people try to build Yara rules on the strings from the file, and sometimes the only strings like visible strings that make sense in the file are strings which are APIs, API calls, basically imports. And you can actually build such a rule. The only catch here is that a lot of files can actually just use the same, absolutely the same imports, and then the Yara rule will fall. So when you do something like this, you need to be extremely, extremely careful. The other mistake that we see a lot of time is when the Yara rule catches just one sample. And here, one of the recommendations that I can make is do not put all the possible criteria as a necessary condition. So if possible, try to avoid the all of a certain string. Let's say if you have 10 strings, if you can go with 5 of them, that is a much better choice than just all of them, because simply one of those strings going away will cause the Yara rule to fail. So here's another example of a Yara rule. We have actually, let's say from some points of view, is a pretty rule in the sense that we know what the rule does from the title. It has a hash, so we can find the sample very easily. The sad point here is that there's a lot of pretty much garbage strings in the air, and the condition without any file size or header check is 19 of them. And if you look carefully, there's actually 19 strings in there. So that's pretty much the same as all of them. This rule will most likely find the original sample and very little chance that will catch anything else. So much better in practice is to use unique or specific strings whenever possible, such as mutex names, rare user agents. Famous Nikon malware, for instance, has a Nokia 95 browser user agent in there. Typo, sometimes you catch something as pretty as software, Microsoft Windows, or registry key. Having something misspelled, so there's like no chance that this will ever work, right? So pretty good choice for the strings in the rule. PDB paths also pretty good. GUIDs, internal module names, encoded or encrypted strings, very good stuff. So the best, I would say, case is when you have, let's say, 2-3 groups of conditions here, some based on unique artifacts in the malware, maybe a group of non-unique strings from the sample, and then maybe some file structure and property there, such as entropy, timestamp. So when you combine all these conditions, it becomes a lot harder for the bad guys to bypass it. So moving further, actually, what we want to do today, we'll try to write a Yara rule for a sample that we have here. Actually, there's 2 samples that we recovered during incident response. The story here is that we are called to do incident response for a diplomatic entity, government entity. And we found 2 samples during incident response. So we want to build a Yara rule for them, and to check and see if we maybe can find more samples. So when we look at the first sample here, what we see, like immediately we see a number of strings in there, a number of error messages. Let's very quickly check the other sample as well. And the other sample also has a couple of plain text strings in it. There's actually an encrypted string in here, but obviously you need to know that's actually an encrypted string. So it's maybe more visible when you load it in something like IDA or Guidra. So when we put them side by side, this is what it looks like. And I'm going to ask you guys if you can help me put together a good Yara rule. So if you can recommend some strings that we can use for the Yara rule by just looking at the 2 samples, that would be quite appreciated from my side. So let's say, do you have any ideas on what we can actually use in this Yara rule? What kind of strings we could use? And, there's already Mr. Quintin suggests the proxy string, which a James string. There's another suggestion, the C/9.exe. Somebody spots CMD/C hostname. Somebody also sees the zero roxy very well. And somebody also spotted this download and dash upload, CMD upload OK. Says new sheen, HTTP put. There's a few other suggestions. James is another suggestion over there. So actually, these are all excellent suggestions, and thank you for helping with that. And we're actually going to try to put together a Yara rule based on these ideas from you. Some observations, as you guys have already seen or noticed, there's some strings like short ones such as James or upload, and those strings alone by themselves, they're not enough. They're just too short or maybe too common. If we use James alone, it will just fire on any file that has James inside. So we need to find some creative ways to combine them together. Then also some strings vary from sample to sample, so that we have 9.exe in one of them, and then we have 99.exe in the other one. But there's like this proxy, and the zero roxy strings which really stand out. And we can use them to build a Yara rule which looks like the following. And I know what you guys will say immediately. You will say, ha ha ha, we got you, Costin. There's no meta section in your rule, so your rule is not very good. But actually, I tell you that I did have a meta section and I removed it in order for the rule to fit the screen. So what we have here, we have actually three groups of conditions in the Yara rule. We have the proxy that you guys spotted and the zero roxy. In case you're wondering what those are, they are actually encryption keys. So they are not like any proxy related stuff. They're just encryption keys. Then, well, we put together a group, let's say a group of strings, which might not be that unique, right? Such as cmd.exe/c host name that simply gets the current system host name. But when we combine with a few other strings, then it will be more solid. And then we have all the other short like James, exit, download, and there, let's say try 4 of C, and they hopefully will allow us to cache the sample. So what I'm going to do now, I'm actually going to fire up this Yara rule on the virus total retro hunt, and I'm going to actually try to share my desktop, and I will copy this rule that I have written before, and I have it here in my clipboard, and I will try to put it into retro hunt. So let's see if that works. All right. So I'll just give it a moment because I know it takes a bit for the screen share to begin. So when that starts, you guys will be able to see my browser. Okay. And I'm gonna copy this strings-based rule, and I will fire it inside virus total. We'll do a new retro hunt job here. We'll paste the Yara rule, and then we'll create a job. And hoping that everything works as expected, then we will have it ready by the end of this presentation. I'm just gonna refresh real quick to see if the retro hunt started. No, then I'll try it one more time. Create job. Well, I exceeded. Oh my God, quota exceeded. This is a terrible kind of error that you never want to see. That's not necessarily a very big problem because I have another window here where I can fire a job with quota. So I hope that you guys now see it running. It's actually just starting now. So I can tell you that this will actually take some time to finish. So we'll have to wait a bit. So while we're waiting for this rule, actually, I'm thinking that, you know, maybe this is not necessarily the best thing that we can do. In other words, it's like 2020, and is this like really the best we can do these days? Can we perhaps do something better than that? And the question is, how can we let's say, be a bit more efficient than the strings-based rule. So one idea that we have been playing for some time is to actually use the fragments of code, unique fragments of code from the malware. And those unique fragments of code, we can actually use them to build a Yara rule. So what I have here actually is a bunch of so-called genotypes produced by our internal tool, the Kaspersky malware attribution engine. So what I did, I took one of the samples, I put it in there, and I guess that you guys immediately can see there's a couple of genotypes in there, and there's a couple of kind of matched unique strings. So one of the, let's say, things that they immediately see from the strings window, not necessarily the genotypes, is that our engine also selects pretty much the same kind of strings that you guys selected, like proxy, 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 cmd/c host name, the zero roxy. It actually selects another one that not many people saw, right? And then there's like an internal PLL name that also kind of skipped. But nevertheless, what we want to do this time, we want to create the Yara rule from the genotypes from one sample. So actually, I'm thinking that we want to see what's better. So is it the good old strings? Could it be the fragments of unique code from one sample? Or we can actually use another system that extracts the common fragments of code between the two samples. So let me share again the screen here on my side, which might take a while. And I have two Yara rules that I have written before the talk. One of them uses just these genotypes, which are in essence unique byte fragments, which are specific to just one of the samples. And the other one is actually a combination of the pretty much shared code across these two samples. So let's fire up a new RetroHunt job, considering that we have enough quota on this other account. So this rule that I am pasting now actually contains all the common code fragments between the two samples. So it's actually produced by a system we call Alice. Actually, we have two systems in the company that do this. One of them is called Alice, the other one is called Bob. And we want to actually see who's better, strings, Alice, or Bob. Which one of these three is actually more efficient at finding samples. So in this rule, actually, we have all these long strings, and the condition over there that you see is two of them. And we can do the two of them because these are pretty much, long enough strings. And the other rule that I will fire up is based on the code fragments from just the first sample, and this is what it looks like. This one actually was produced by the Bob system, unlike the other that was produced by the Alice system. And this one is, let's say, a bit different from the Alice rule in the sense that all the fragments here that you can see, they are much shorter actually in size, and in reality they only appear in one of the samples. And the condition, to be honest, this is more risky because it's shorter code fragments can appear in more samples. We need to have a more strict condition such as 10 of them, but we have 237 different strings in there, which hopefully do the job. So I've started all these three rules. And now there's good news and bad news. The good news, well, maybe let's start with the bad news. The bad news is that we need to wait for about half an hour to see the results. The good news is that this is actually quite fast, and actually we used to wait for hours in the past, but thanks to VirusTotal guys, they've actually sped up these greatly, and nowadays this takes a lot less time than it used to. Um, the only issue, I guess, is what can we do for all these half an hour while we are waiting for the rules to fire. So allow me to welcome to our intermission. And some people, they ask me like, Costin, you always make presentations, but your presentations are like not very realistic. Like, is it truly what you do in the real life? And I'll tell you guys that this is what I do in the real life. I fire up the Yara rules in the air, and then you need to do something else. So what we're going to do now in our intermission, actually, I was thinking to watch some live football games, um, NFL, maybe some hockey. The only problem is that all these different things have been postponed, canceled, and so on. Such as, for instance, France canceled all the football and rugby seasons. Quite terrible, actually. And there isn't much to do nowadays online in terms of watching games, unless you actually consider something else, which is chess. So actually, when we talk about chess, it's kind of interesting that this is becoming more and more popular nowadays, and even, politicians have started to play chess. I guess. Um, for instance, when Bernie Sanders endorsed Joe Biden, he actually suggested, he said, you and I have our differences, so maybe we should play a game of chess, which is a kind of a tricky proposal. In general, the person who suggests, let's play a game of chess to see who's better, usually is the strongest player. And some people actually notice that well, Bernie Sanders has a chessboard behind him, so probably he trains on a regular basis. The other interesting thing which I noticed is that Arnold Schwarzenegger, another famous politician, is also spending time playing chess with his donkey Lulu. And actually, I thought this was a beautiful message saying that if you've been putting off something like learning chess with your family, use the time you'd normally be out and about. And here is a photo of uh, the man himself playing chess with Lulu. So actually, the reality, and I was talking to a friend of mine who runs an online chess website. He was saying, hey, Costin, do you know that actually due to this COVID thingy, there are now more people playing online chess than ever in the history of the humankind? So to be honest, I didn't know that. So I tell you that if you're a good player, then what you can do, you can play online. But if you're a very poor player like myself, you can go online and watch the games that other people play. So when I go online and look at other games, for instance, I go to chessgames.com, and I found there's actually a lot of games that were played by someone called NN. And I was wondering to myself, who is like this NN guy? And there's other people who actually have the same curiosity as myself. And actually, people notice that NN probably must be the worst chess player in the world because he almost always loses. And what is even more interesting is that he's been playing games for over 500 years. So he must be very, very old nowadays. So I was thinking like, yeah, I want to know who is this guy who lives for 500 years. So I went to my favorite search engine, DuckDuckGo, put there the NN, and I got a quite interesting result. In my opinion, these are not your typical chess players. So I said maybe there's something wrong with the engine. So I tried Google, and when you search for NN on Google, you get something similarly confusing. So actually, if you go to the profile for NN on the Chess Games website, you actually see that NN won only about 5% of the game he played. And actually, I'll tell you a secret that NN stands for no name. It's just anonymous. And while I was looking at the same website between some of the games that NN played, I noticed there's some guy named Morphe, which seems to be the hell out of this NN guy. And in particular, we see that in some games like the one here, played in 1858, it says something like blindfold simul 3B, 4B, 4B, 5B. So anybody has any idea what that means? 3B, 4B, 5B. And look at the chat. They say that indeed what it means is that Morphe was playing blindfold, so something like this. And he was not just playing blindfold, but Morphe was playing 5 different boards, 5 different people at the same time blindfold, which is kind of a very impressive ability that very few people have. So actually, who is this Morphe guy? Well, this is actually a guy called Paul Morphy. That's probably one of the greatest chess players of all times. Was born in New Orleans, and he was a kind of the unofficial world chess champion in the mid 1800s. And he actually managed to beat all the top players at that time except for Staunton, and they tried a lot to set up this game between Morphy and Staunton, but the reality is that Staunton was way too afraid to play him, so this actually never happened. But otherwise, he was able to beat pretty much everybody. And there's a nice website called Chessmerics that tries to calculate the strength of different chess players using the ELO algorithm. And to be honest, the ELO algorithm was only invented in the 1970s or 60s, I guess. So it was definitely not available around the time when Paul Morphy was playing. But people looking at his old games with computers actually were able to calculate that Morphy's ELO was somewhere, well, the highest rating that he ever reached was around 2743. I tell you that even with today's technology and nowadays learning chess is so much easier than it used to be in the 1850s, still Morphy from back then would be in the top 20 best players in the world, which is very impressive. The other thing, kind of sad, people called Morphy the pride and sorrow of chess because he only played for about 4 years before retiring. So Morphy actually studied to become a lawyer, and he was able to finish his studies so quickly in like way less years than normally it took. So actually he finished his studies, but he couldn't become a lawyer because he was too young. So that was a prerequisite in those days. And for about 4 days, he had to wait about four years to, well, achieve the good age so that he can become a lawyer. He played chess for about 4 years, and then he retired to never play again. However, the games that Morphy played in these years are quite impressive, and we'll actually try to look at one of the games that Morphy played with one of the NNs. And one of the interesting things in this game, well, and I'm going to ask you if you guys see anything unusual in this chessboard. Is there like anything unusual in the chessboard that you guys can spot? And I'm going to give you a hint. It's not the QR code. Actually, wow, Dave Itel is the first one to notice there is no rook. So actually, Morphy was such a strong player that at some point he refused to play anyone on the same terms. So he would give people odds. He would just take a rook off the board and say, you know, I'll give you a rook and still play with you. Or sometimes he would even, let's say, give a queen if he was playing with a weaker player. So let's actually try to take a look at this game that Morphy played. So I'm going to do the screen share again. And I will fire up my chessboard software. move it over here so that you guys can see the game. All right, so again, just to remember, Morphy played this game in 1850 against someone anonymous, and the reason why this person's name is not really known is, well, I wouldn't want to be that guy who was playing against Morphy, and you'll see why. So Morphy actually played e4, and in most of his games, Morphy played e4. I'll give you a tip, guys. So whenever you play chess and you see someone playing the first move, you can very quickly say if they are, let's say, a serious chess player by just watching the very first moves they're playing. So sometimes I see people they're playing something like h4, which is the pawn at the side of the board. So they're playing something like h4, this. Uh, and a chess master, like a grandmaster, he immediately knows that that's not really a strong move, because in reality in chess, all the fight actually happens in the center of the board. So with the first move, Morphy immediately he wants to try to gain a bit of control in the center. And his guy, he plays e5, kind of try to balance the position. He doesn't want Morphy to have all the center. The other principle that Morphy always used in his games, he would develop his pieces early. So he plays knight f3, immediately attacking this pawn in the center, right? So if the black doesn't do anything on the next move, the white will just capture the pawn in the center. So obviously the black needs to protect it somehow. And the black protects it with the knight to c6. Then Morphy plays bishop c4. Which is an opening called Italian game, and Morphy actually liked this a lot because it gives a lot of attacking power to the white. So when you're playing with someone, so you're like down a rook, you can't play, let's say, a long boring game. You need to attack. You need to play in a very aggressive manner. And Bobby Fischer also said that the bishop to c4, it's on the best position on the board. So then the black plays knight to f6, and Morphy immediately plays knight to g5. And now you can see that Morphy is threatening a very dangerous thing here. He's hitting this f7 pawn twice with both the bishop and the knight. So there are not many chases. Obviously, if Morphy on the next move stays with the bishop, that's check. So the king needs to move. So the situation is not, let's say, looking very good for black already. And we're just a few moves into the game. So the only actually move that the black can play here is try to prevent that from happening by playing d5. And that immediately hits Morphy's bishop. So Morphy needs to take. The other guy takes back the pawn with the knight. And now, of course, Morphy could capture back the knight with the bishop. Then the black takes bishop with the queen, and the game continues. But that, well, let's say, doesn't go in the same line of thinking, which is that Morphy wants to be aggressive and attack. So Morphy plays a very kind of risky move here, something that computers nowadays would never play. He plays a knight takes to f7. And this, let's say there's like not many options here. If the king doesn't take the knight, he will, on the next move, he will either take the queen or he will take the rook, right? So there's not many choices here. If you want to keep the things going, the king needs to capture the knight, which is what the black guy does. But this opens, let's say, an immediate attack for Morphy, which moves the queen to f3 check. So now you see that the queen is hitting the king, so the king needs to retreat somewhere. But there's kind of a trick here that you see that both the bishop and the queen are hitting the knight in the center at the same time twice. So the knight is only defended one time. So let's say if the king moves back to e8, Morphy will just take the knight on the next move, and that will be bad. So pretty much the only possible choice here would be for the king to get closer to the knight and protect it, right? Which is what the black guy does. And now again, a theme that we see a lot in Morphy's games, which is that he likes to develop his pieces. So he develops his other knight to c3. And now you see that actually the black knight is getting hit 3 times. It's getting hit by the queen. It's getting hit by this knight. It's getting hit by this bishop. And it is only defended twice by the queen and the king. So the other guy, obviously, he wants to prevent the loss of this knight. The other problem is that the black cannot really move the knight from there because the king is in check, right? So he moves the other knight before, but kind of behind, protecting the front knight. And Morphy castles. So one of the principles in chess is the king safety. So it's hard to begin an attack without having your king in safety, and that's what Morphy does. So the other guy, well, he thinks, man, this knight in the center is kind of weak, so I'm going to try to protect it another time and then maybe move the king away from the center, try to run away with the king. So maybe let's say it's not surprising that he plays this c6 move protecting the knight. So now you see that the black knight is solidly protected by this pawn, by this knight, by the king, and by the queen. So it's like very well protected. Well, now the king can move away, hide somewhere on the queen side, unless Morphy does something. And what Morphy does here, he plays d4. He tries to kind of break the center open. So whenever, let's say, Morphy played games, he liked to play what are called open positions. So in these open positions, the combinations are much more powerful than in so closed positions. And in the open positions was actually where Morphy excelled. So the black guy does a terrible mistake here by taking this pawn, and this opens kind of a finishing combination for white. So this is pretty much the beginning of the disaster for the black. And the first thing he does a check with the rook, and the king, you see, cannot move to the f file because the queen is there. So the only chance is for the king to move to the d file. And Morphy continues with the attack. He takes this knight in the center. The black guy takes it back with the knight. Then Morphy takes it with the bishop. The black takes it back with the pawn. And from here, well, obviously, you can see that still the black is in a much better position material-wise. The black still has 2 rooks, and the black still has 2 bishops. But Morphy, you see, has only 1 bishop left, 1 rook, and the queen. So the difference in material is still quite significant. So he continues by check with the queen. And again, there's only one option for the king. You see that the king can only go to 1 square on the board, which is the c7 square. Morphy continues with the check with the remaining bishop. Again, there's not many choices here. Just put the bishop in front, but Morphy takes, well, he moves the queen to the side to give another check, and you see that the black cannot take the queen actually because it will be a discovered check, so that's not possible. So the black guy, he moves further away from the check. It's again the only possibility. There's no other good place where the king can go and avoid checkmate. So imagine if the king goes here to d7, then it's checkmate on the next move. So the king goes away, and Morphy sacrifices his queen. There's again only 1 move on the board, and Morphy checkmates with the bishop to d6, which is a kind of a beautiful combination. You see that the black guy still has 2 rooks and 1 bishop, and those 2 rooks and the bishop, they never left their original parking positions. They're in the same place as the beginning of the game. On the other hand, Morphy, who started down a rook, basically just left with one rook and one bishop, but for him that was kind of enough to checkmate his opponent in a beautiful combination. I'm gonna stop sharing now and go back to my slides over here and continue. Well, with, let's say, maybe some conclusions from these games from this game that Morphy played. And when we look at chess games, we see that in general all the strong players can play blindfold. I'm not a strong player. I can sometimes play about maybe 10, 15 moves blindfold before the whole situation gets fuzzy. But strong players can very easily play blindfold chess, and sometimes they can play several boards at the same time. I've seen, for instance, Magnus Carlsen, the world chess champion, playing 8 people at the same time blindfold and winning against all 8. So some of the advice for playing, so if you guys are thinking about playing a bit of chess online or with friends, keep in mind that the center is important. So try to take all your pieces out and early in the game. Remember how Morphy developed all his pieces, the knights, the bishop early in the game. Try to create, let's say, combinations or give possibilities for creating combinations. Morphy really liked to play open games, and he always kind of played, for the long run. But what is probably the most beautiful thing about Morphy's games is that back in the days, winning was not really the most important thing in chess. What was really more important was playing beautiful games. So there are stories that sometimes people heard that Morphy was coming to visit their town, and they would gather at the, let's say, place where Morphy was staying and demand that he play some beautiful game. They didn't necessarily want to see him win. They wanted to see him win in a spectacular fashion. So at some point, Morphy said that he just doesn't want this stress anymore. So he kind of stopped playing chess because it was becoming way too stressing to deliver these beautiful combinations every single time. But I can, say absolutely the same thing about current games nowadays. If you look at the big chess masters, the big games, they're playing very long and very cautious. So nobody, for instance, plays nowadays the famous King's Gambit. That's was one of the most popular openings back in the days of Morphy. But nowadays, nobody plays it anymore because it's too risky. People play very careful games for hours sometimes, which in my opinion are kind of boring. The other thing that we wanted to look at today, and I did mention the fact that there's famous politicians playing chess, and I couldn't skip at this amazing opportunity to look at one of the games that Arnold Schwarzenegger actually played against his donkey Lulu. And he posted this actually photo himself, and I spent some time trying to set up the board and try to figure out which moves were played here in which order. So we can actually see that Arnold is playing white, and Lulu the donkey is actually playing black. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to actually load this position real quick in my chess app. Over here, I'm going to share the screen again with you guys. Let's see if that works. The Arnold Lulu game. Very interesting. Particularly quite an interesting position. So some things that we can immediately notice about the game. By the way, I noticed that Arnold was making a kind of a wave at Lulu, suggesting that it's actually Lulu's turn to move. So I assume so that the black is now supposed to move. And one of the things that you notice here immediately is that the next move for black, it's actually quite tricky. So you see that Arnold has 2 pawns in the center. He developed the knights, which is again very good. And imagine just that maybe Lulu wants to move or to develop the knight here to f6, which is a kind of, let's say, typical position for the knight early in the game. That can be immediately met with something like pawn to e5, so then the knight has to go back. So you see immediately that Arnold, definitely a connoisseur when it comes to chess, he opened by pushing all the middle pawns, to the center, trying to get some control there. Because again, remember that the fight happens in the center. So it's also interesting to know that Lulu kind of developed on the queen side, all these pawns here on the queen side, and there's some threats, right? So for instance, there's this pawn here which threatens to move forward and attack the knight in c3, and there's also this bishop supporting this push, right? Which is why I guess that Arnold played the a3 move here. One thing which doesn't really make sense to me is the fact that he played this h4 move probably in the early in the game. It's not necessarily a bad move, but it just I don't think that I really see the purpose of this move. So one of the things we can actually do here, we can actually fire up the chess engine and to get an idea on how bad or how good the situation is, to try to understand if these guys are like playing an even game, or maybe Arnold is so much better than the donkey, right? So the engine says there's a kind of a 1.2 advantage for white. It recommended black to play h6, then e5. It moves now. You can see that it moves, repositions the knight, tries to build kind of a wing on the king side for the king probably to escape and to fianchetto the white bishop. The evaluation of this position, again, is there something around 0.7, 1.4 at the moment, which is kind of telling us that it's not that bad. So you see that the computer tries to find a way for black to castle the king, right? It developed a knight in there. The king now castles, and it'll try to find some ways to probably to develop the other pieces. I would say that it's an even position. Anything can happen. For sure, the black is kind of cramped on the queen side. You see all the black pieces who are stuck on the back rank, while the white actually has everything developed. Everything from the white side is developed. At the same time, the computer thinks there's a 0.5, 0.7 plus advantage for white, which is kind of nothing. So I know that actually Arnold said that Lulu is still learning to play, and you can see actually why he might be saying that, because some of the moves made by Lulu were probably not the strongest moves out there, but at the same time, they're not really a disaster. So I would say that actually that's a quite an interesting and instructive chess game. Maybe something that you wouldn't have expected. But very cool to see that Arnold, one of my favorite movie actors, playing in the center, developing his knights early in the game. That's good stuff. So it has thumbs up from my side. All right, so now back to the Yara. Well, looking at the screen, I can tell you that these Yara rules are still running. So unfortunately, we cannot see the live results, but I'll tell you a secret. I did run these rules before, and I know what are, let's say, the numbers. What we have here actually, maybe it was kind of expected, maybe not, I'm not sure. But basically the strings-based rule that we wrote catches 9 samples. The genotypes rule, the one with the genotypes extracted from 1 sample, it caught 10 samples on VirusTotal RetroHunt. And the one with the common code across the 2 samples actually catches 18 different samples. So I would say that we have a winner here. And what is the lesson that we can actually extract from this experiment, the life experiment that we've done? When you have one sample, it's kind of tricky actually to write an efficient Yara rule. So one thing you can do, maybe you can write a rule based on the strings. Maybe that will find you a few more samples. Now that you have a few more samples, it actually makes sense to write a rule based on the common shared code across these different samples. And, again, so kind of expected, maybe not. But, well, if you guys are hungry for more, I recommend you the webinar that I gave about hunting APTs with Yara. Consider writing your own rules, deploying Clara, and just let us know if you'd be interested in online trainings, in Yara online trainings. That's a link. I will share it also on Twitter afterwards. And by the way, if you guys are hungry for more chess, I can recommend you latechess.org, which is probably the best site for playing chess online, in my humble opinion. Chess.com, chessable.com, the best learning tool. And streamers that I like on Twitch, Chessbra, Hikaru Nakamura, who plays live quite a lot of times, and Alexandra Botez, a women's international master, I think, of Romanian origin, who is also a very fun and entertaining streamer that I can definitely recommend. So with that in mind, thank you guys very much. Less talk, more Yara, more chess.
Do you recommend us to folks that they deploy their own Yara rules over VT from a confidentiality perspective?
Well, speaking strictly from my side, I do deploy my rules on Aristotle, and I do have like a full trust in Bernardo, Julio, Victor, and the other guys. So I do deploy my own rules on Aristotle on a regular basis.
Can you discuss your strategy for picking out genotype lengths?
Oh yeah, that's tricky. Actually, we try playing with longer genotypes, with shorter genotypes. Let's say reach the sweet spot, which is the size that we are using nowadays, 16 bytes. If you do like longer ones, then you find less stuff. If you do shorter ones, then you have false positives. So in the experiments that we have run, 16 worked well. But again, you've seen that the rule that had the shared common code between the two samples actually had longer genotypes in there, and it worked much better than the one with 10 of 200.